I'm James Smith. This is The Popular Show. I'm at Manchester Arena where on the 22nd of May 2017 Salman Abedi detonated a suicide bomb killing 22 people, most of them children. Declassified have put out a film about the extent of the deep state links of Abedi, and I spoke to the director, Phil Miller, about the film. To get part one of this interview, I want you to click below to the Popularity Media YouTube channel. If you like Sublation, you're going to love Popularity Media, and then come back here for part two, which is rolling now.
So if Libyan agents, as it were not having the same scrutiny on them as Syrian ones, nonetheless, you describe in the film this episode where the Abedis are rescued by the Royal Navy and taken to Malta. This pretty dramatic episode where, as you say in the film, it's kind of implausible that these people were not extremely known to the security services thereafter, and really figures that they should have been, and presumably actually were, keeping a close eye on. Could you describe that episode for us?
Yeah, so there's a group of British Libyan citizens in Tripoli, I think in August 2014, who were evacuated onto HMS Enterprise and taken to Malta, and then some of them are flown back to Manchester Airport. Now, it's not really clear how that list of who got evacuated was drawn up, what the criteria was, and how much was known about them. But it certainly shows a level of knowledge and also a huge opportunity as well. We've just evacuated these people from an area that's being threatened by militia fighting. They're going to go back to the UK. You would have thought it'd be a good idea to find out as much as you can about what they know and what they've been involved in. And the inquiry heard that the Abedi brothers agreed to be debriefed, we presume by counter-terrorism police, when they came back to Manchester Airport. But there's no record of that debriefing that's been made available. It's not clear if it still exists or not. So again, that's another sort of black hole in terms of what happened at that point of contact with British security services. And I think that, that's an area where in the film we interview Andrew Roussos, whose daughter Safi Rose was 8 years old when she was killed in the attack. She was the youngest victim. And I think that's something that he really struggles to accept, that, what happened with that debriefing? Why don't we know more about that? And why were they allowed to continue carry on coming and going thereafter? Because that was 2014, but they then went back to Libya, I think twice in 2016 or 2017. And also Salman Abedi's older brother, Ismail, was stopped separately coming back from his honeymoon in Indonesia in 2015, and they downloaded a whole raft of pro-ISIS material on his device as well. And we just heard yesterday that there's now finally an arrest warrant out for Ismail, because he was meant to give evidence to the public inquiry last year, but he tried to leave the country the day before. He was stopped by police, and then he was allowed to leave the country the next day. We presume he's now in Libya or Turkey. So there's now an arrest warrant for him for skipping the inquiry. But, I think there was his DNA was found on a hammer that was used to build part of the bomb. So, there's serious questions about what he knew, particularly about the brothers' radicalization. And also the father, Ramadan Abedi, he's also wanted by police for questioning because his fingerprints were found in the car that was used to store the bomb components. So, I think this is why as well, it's, we're quite justified in this film on focusing on the family, other family members, because you could argue, the sons did this, the father had nothing to do with it. But I think, the fact the father is wanted for questioning by the police, and there's all this evasive behavior going on, and this history of having been involved in this group, which was banned as a terrorist organization, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. That's why we felt it was important to investigate these angles in the film and set out as much as we could find.
What else is suspicious or should have raised flags between Abedi's return to Britain in 2014 and then his death carrying out the bombing in 2017. I mean, one thing that stands out in the film is the interactions with Abdul Rauf Abdullah, who was imprisoned a year before the attack for recruiting for Islamic State, if I got that right, and Abedi was phoning him from in prison, right?
Yeah, and I think he went to visit him in prison, and they had a huge number of text messages between them that the police seized and had access to for Abdul Rauf's trial that showed, this support or evidence of support for ISIS. But the police didn't look at who that phone was registered to, even though it wasn't a burner phone. It had been, formally registered in Salman Abedi's name. So that's another kind of glaring failure by the security services. And we also look at this other family, the Ben Hamidi family, who the father again had been in the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and had actually been put on a sanctions list after 9/11 as a key financier of the group. Whether he was or not, is contested, but in terms of the official position, that's what he was down for. And then his sons, one of them was arrested at Manchester Airport, I think in 2014. So this was shortly before the Abedis were evacuated on HMS Enterprise. And he'd come back into Manchester Airport with a sniper manual. I think it was found on one of his electronic devices. And he was put in Belmarsh, and Salman Abedi made multiple calls or attempted calls to him while he was in a Belmarsh. This is all on the Belmarsh prison records. And our understanding is that the case against this Ben Hamidi son eventually collapsed because he was going to call the Ministry of Defence as a witness for the defence to say that this sniper manual came from NATO training in Libya. So again, this is this kind of signs that these guys that appeared to be, or were being accused of terrorism, actually had quite deep links with NATO forces going back to the uprising in 2011. So the case against him collapsed, and he was released. And then he had a younger brother as well, and they were working out in Germany. I think their father had a property business out there, and Salman Abedi's younger brother Hashim went out to work for that family. I think in the year before the bombing, and Hashim Abedi was eventually convicted as Salman Abedi's accomplice. So this was another family, the Ben Hamidis, that had this long accusation, or in some case a formal sanction for terrorist activity, that the Abedis were mixing quite openly with, and yet this didn't really seem to concern MI5. I think MI5 were planning to review a sort of a file that they had on Salman Abedi about a couple of weeks after the bombing, but clearly by then it was too late, and these things should have been ringing alarm bells much sooner.
One of the things that Mark bemoans or condemns in one of his to the camera moments in the film is that despite the hearings and reports, commissioned reports and investigations into this, we haven't meaningfully heard from MI5 in terms of what their side of the story is. And this is just jaw-dropping that we have a family whose whole history is of having been kind of washed from side to side in on the whim of the Libyan elites and then British elites. We have a guy who is already from this kind of tempestuous background, who is then effectively recruited by the British state into this pretty doomed military adventure, returns, continues a pattern of absolutely suspicious behavior, and then is allowed to walk through one of the biggest cities in the country alone with a backpack, an enormous backpack on his back. Police vacate the area. He kills a load of kids, and we're expected to take this kind of patched together account of what happened at face value. Why hasn't MI5 answered for this? How typical is it that they wouldn't? And what is your read? I mean, quite often with situations like this, a platform like Declassified will show us the known unknowns, and then we're kind of left hanging. I wondered if, you can say the kind of what and why as far as MI5 are concerned, just in your personal view.
Yeah. I think, I mean, they must be hugely embarrassed by what happened, because it's clearly an enormous failure, and there were so many warnings. And even if you say, well, that there are lots of people they had to watch out for, I guess the response to that would be, well, why then did we allow people to go out to Libya in the first place to fight in a conflict which was quite likely to radicalize large numbers of young men in Manchester? And something that we try and draw out in the film is this assessment that was made in 2010, the year before the uprising, which is it's quite chilling, really. It's not been published in full, but parts of it were read out to the inquiry. And it basically profiles the Abedi boys perfectly, because it says the children of Libyan Islamic extremists who are involved in drug gangs in Manchester, which the Abedis were, are a high risk, basically, of radicalization themselves. And this was in 2010, the year before they were then allowed to go out and fight in this revolution and mix with lots of dangerous groups. So that was in 2010. And then, like you're saying, even in the years right before the bombing and the months before the bombing, there were even more warning signs. So MI5 only had to give evidence to the public inquiry in secret. So these weren't public sessions. And all that was made public was a gist of the MI5 evidence. And originally, these were meant to be inquests. After there's a deaths of these natures, you normally have a coroner's inquest. But these were converted into a public inquiry because the security services flat out refused to participate with the inquests. And basically, a public inquiry gives the intelligence agencies a greater level of secrecy, and allows for these kind of secret hearings. So that's the kind of background to it. But obviously, the intelligence agencies in the UK aren't subject to freedom of information. There is a parliamentary committee that has some access to them, but the personnel on that committee, the MPs on it, are pretty establishment now, and their report into the Arena attack is pretty redacted as well. And so, no one from MI5, even though the head of MI5, the Director General, is a publicly known person, he didn't have to give evidence. And this has been a pattern after the London Bridge attacks. I went to the inquiry for that. And again, the MI5 witness was, I think in that case, we were able to hear the witness, but we weren't allowed to see them. So, with the Arena attack, it was an even more secretive process. And MI6 weren't asked to give evidence at all, nor were GCHQ or Defence Intelligence. And you would have thought that they'd know something about, particularly with MI6's alleged involvement with the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group in the 90s. With the uprising in 2011, MI6, Defence Intelligence, GCHQ, Special Forces must have been, they were heavily involved with liaising with these rebel groups. All these airstrikes that were being called in. There was clearly a communication process for that. So, the inquiry, whilst it has brought out a lot of important information, it really hasn't gone far enough. But I must say, the inquiry, it was a help to us because people really didn't want to talk. And I think because the inquiry compelled people to talk, at least there was some stuff coming out. I think without that, we'd know even less. But clearly we do need and deserve to know much more.
The Manchester bombing also had a political significance because it happened during the 2017 general election period, and I've often argued that the British left really needs to take hold of it as an important moment in its recent history. We had Steve Howell on the show describing, and Andrew Murray as well, who described being Jeremy Corbyn's election advisors at the time of the bombing. And in the clip we showed from your film, from Blowback, you include a little moment from that speech where Corbyn really sort of transgressed a norm in attributing the tragedy and attributing the terrorism attack in part to this history of British foreign policy. And this is, we've said it many times on the show, but this is a very important moment because everybody in the media and in the Labour Party acted like this was a disastrous decision. And as I recall, one of the leaked texts from one of the members of staff in the Labour Party, who were obviously busy siphoning off funds to their preferred MPs at the time, texted in one of these WhatsApp groups saying normal people don't blame foreign policy, normal people blame immigration. This was the expectation. And yet, actually, after that speech, polling showed that people were enormously sympathetic to Corbyn's reading of the situation and enormously sympathetic to the kind of analysis that we get from you guys at Declassified. All that, of course, was well before we had any idea that Corbyn saying that British foreign policy is at stake in events like this was even more literally true than he necessarily meant it in the speech. You know, we've got this Prevent program, which says that teachers have to report like a 12-year-old Muslim boy if he's acting a bit depressed in class or if he pushes another kid, and yet their own creature, the security service's own creature, as Abedi effectively was, is allowed to walk through Manchester unhindered and blow up children. Actually, that speech that Corbyn gave, so much of that kind of memory of that 2017 period has become frittered away and undermined by what's happened since. But actually, there was a political importance to that, and I wondered kind of how you look back on that aspect of it. I think it's the right decision not to get into party politics, particularly in the film. But I mean, what's your take there?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was uncannily on the money, really, with what he said. I mean, he said two things in that speech. I mean, he gave the kind of boilerplate praise for the emergency services in responding to the atrocity. And then he made this much more controversial claim about how we need to understand why this happened and it's likely to be blowback from foreign policy. As it turned out, actually, the emergency services had performed terribly that night. There were enormous delays in getting people the medical first aid that they needed, and some people quite possibly died as a result of that. So that part of what he said was wrong, but no one attacked him for that. All the ire was focused on this claim, which I think the film bears out, that it was blowback from foreign policy. And like you say, in the Labour leaks report at the time, this was a real red line within the Labour Party machine, even though the public did seem to agree with what Corbyn was saying. I mean, the 7/7 attacks in London, MI5 had said that the invasion of Iraq would increase the risk of terrorism at home, and it did. That was a motive for those attacks. So this was, again, another case of blowback, not from Iraq this time, but from Libya. So I think it is really important. I think there is a bit of a hesitancy on the left because this is an issue that the far right also like to kind of try and grab hold of and use it to say, well, asylum seekers and Muslims are all dangerous and we shouldn't have anything like that. But actually, in the film, we try and show that the one of the imams at Didsbury Mosque, at the Abedi's local mosque, was actually very critical of the Abedi family and was trying to de-radicalize them. And he was also an asylum seeker himself from Libya. So often, the strongest voices are people within this community in terms of trying to prevent these attacks. And he was kind of hung out to dry. He now lives in hiding because of threats to his life from extremists who still seem to be able to threaten him. So it is, I think it's a very important issue for the left, particularly with that history of 2017 and the Corbyn election campaign, how this came right in the middle of the attack and how he was able to respond to it so robustly with this critique of foreign policy, which not only fitted with his kind of ideology, but also I think the evidence does bear it out. It was a key moment.
Yeah, I think you're quite right that one shouldn't be worried about echoing the far right. Actually, it's the far right and the soft liberal position that has most in common, I think, in treating immigrants and asylum seekers from war zones as homogeneously likely to suddenly become bad in the far right reading, and homogeneously apolitical in the nervously soft liberal. You used to say Guardian reader, but they're as bloodthirsty as anyone these days. The soft liberal position. Actually, what this film is a great document of is showing the highly and necessarily politicized nature of communities that have their roots in being displanted by war zones, which are after all substantially the creation of a century plus of the direction in Western foreign policy. So it's extremely important from that point of view. Again, as I said before, it's almost hard to remember that moment of the left making a response to a foreign policy disaster or an event connected to one, making their case as Corbyn did, and then having affirmation immediately follow. That, as I recall, the polling said that most Tory voters also agreed with Corbyn on that. We seem very far from that now. Corbyn again is in trouble this week for remarks on Ukraine, which coverage that you've been making in Declassified, which has a certain amount in common with this film, might help us to understand.
Isn't going to bring about a solution. It's only going to prolong and exaggerate this war. We might be in for years and years of a war in the Ukraine. But then the world woke up and suddenly realized that Russia and Ukraine are the world's biggest grain exporters, and something has to be done. So they came to an agreement, and I hope it holds, to export grain through Odessa and through the Bosphorus to the rest of the world. That is a good move. But at the same time, putting more and more arms into Ukraine isn't going to bring about it. What I find disappointing is that hardly any of the world's leaders use the word peace. They always use the language of more war and more bellicose war. Ukrainians are dying. Ukrainians have gone into exile. Thousands and thousands. And Russian soldiers are dying. Conscripted young Russian soldiers are dying. This war is disastrous for the people of Ukraine, for the people of Russia, and for the safety and security of the whole world. And therefore, there has to be much more effort put into peace. I think it's good that Antonio Guterres eventually went to Moscow, but mainly to talk about Mariupol at that time. I think the UN ought to be centre stage in this. And if the UN cannot negotiate a ceasefire of some sort, they'd bring in somebody else who can.
So that interview has attracted the usual ire and the usual commentary that this is Corbyn endorsing withdrawing support for Ukraine. This is Corbyn siding with Putin. This is Corbyn, the mealy-mouthed peacenik who can't face facts about the nature of conflict. Now, we hardly expect blowback of the exact kind that we saw from Britain's support for Islamist militants in Iraq, Libya, and Syria. But nonetheless, there is some similarity here in the fact that we are effectively flooding a region with arms in a pretty imprecise way and without too much curiosity about where it's going. And much as was the case with Syria, we've also got a record of backing both horses in the race. I read on your website that Liz Truss approved 289 million of UK exports with potential military use to Russia before the Ukraine invasion. That's Liz Truss, the likely next prime minister. So certain structural similarities to the Libya one. I expect a lot of people will watch Blowback and approvingly, who maybe in 2017 would have regarded you as some kind of monster or some kind of unpatriotic, useful idiot, or the usual kind of things. So it's always easy to, have an anti-imperialist judgment of things that happened a few years ago, and much harder in the present. I wondered what lessons there are from Blowback for this current conflict, which, if anything, seems to be even more McCarthyite in terms of what it's possible to say about it than even Libya was in the past decade.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the interesting things about, while we were making this film, obviously a lot of other things were happening in the world, namely Russian invasion of Ukraine. And NATO was casting itself as a defensive alliance, and any kind of criticism of NATO was being put kind of beyond the pale. And obviously, while we were making this film, something we were looking at was NATO's role during that 2011 uprising, and which groups they were arming, and how this wasn't a defensive operation. It was a very aggressive operation to topple a regime. So I think it's interesting to watch it now and have Ukraine kind of in the back of your mind. There is a risk of far right terrorism from Ukraine. There was a case a couple of years back where a white supremacist from Ukraine, I think his name was Pavlo Lapshin, murdered a elderly Muslim man in the UK, and I think that was in 2013. And obviously since then, the far right in Ukraine post Maidan has become a lot more organised and well armed, particularly the Azov battalion. There's been, the UK has acknowledged that some of its weapons to Ukraine were likely to have ended up with the Azov battalion. Obviously, one section of that group in Mariupol has been are now prisoners of war in Russian-held territory, but the group's brand seems to have spread to other parts of Ukraine. Yeah. So that ideology is clearly there, and those people will have access to those arms. And even before this conflict, corruption in Ukraine was a real problem, and arms trafficking out of Ukraine was a real problem. So who knows where these weapons will end up in a number of years' time. And, this was something that before the invasion, the Guardian was reporting about counterterrorism police at UK airports being worried about far-right people traveling out to Ukraine. And then obviously after the invasion, that was pretty hard to talk about. I think now you are starting to see a bit more of that discussion, and there are reports about various EU bodies being worried about the arms control issue. The Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee recently published a report on far-right extremism in the UK, which interestingly didn't mention Ukraine at all. Certainly not in the open sections. There were redacted sections where we don't know what countries they refer to. But yeah, you would hope that this is an issue that Whitehall has learnt from. and they will try and stop this happening again. But what we've seen, people like Liz Truss encouraging people to go out and fight in Ukraine, this kind of incredibly reckless rhetoric that we saw in February. Who knows what will happen to those people?
Yeah, I mean, it's overused, but obviously the first time is tragedy, second time farce applies here. I mean, sending the Abedis and their ilk back to Libya to fight Gaddafi, okay, it was a pretty reckless and crazy idea, unless you want things to get reckless and crazy, of course. But you were actually talking about people with serious training and a military past. Today, we're talking about advising normal civilians to go and fight in Ukraine. I guess we're going to have to wait, for the declassified film in a few years' time in order to really be able to get a grip on it. Phil Miller, thanks so much for joining us on the Popular Show. Viewers can watch this film, and you really must. It's called Blowback, The Road to Manchester. It's just out, and you can watch it on the Declassified website. You just have to join up for free, but we strongly recommend that you pay a bit too to what is really one of the best investigative platforms that we have in Britain right now. Thanks again, Phil.
Thanks, James. Thank you.